Balthazar Gracian was a writer and rhetorician in the 17th century in Spain, and he had this quotation that I really like. He said, "A speech is a feast at which the dishes are made to please the guests and not the cooks." And I like this quotation because it summarizes for me what I see as the importance of remaining audience-oriented. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about how to craft an audience-oriented speech. So let's begin then. What do I mean when I say audience-oriented? I mean designing and delivering a speech aimed at satisfying the needs of the audience. And it's important to remember for this definition that a speech isn't for you, it's for the audience. If you were just doing speeches for you, you could go do them in front of the mirror in your bathroom. That's happy and wonderful, but that's not what speaking is about. No, the reason you're addressing an audience is to help them understand something or help them to do something. They, the audience, should be getting something out of the transaction. Why else would they pay attention if they're not going to get something out of this? So you want to be able to balance what you want to say on a topic with what the audience needs to hear on that topic. And we could maybe contrast an audience-oriented speech with something like a content-oriented speech or speaker-oriented speech. And let me give you an example of this. So I had a friend who went to Princeton Seminary, a very august institution. And when he was there, there was this class that he had to take. And the professor who taught it had taught it for like a billion years. And this professor would assign a chapter from the book that he had written. And so each class session, the class would have to read a chapter from this book. Okay, that's not uncommon. Well, here's how the class actually played out. When people would come into class, they would file into class, the professor would come in carrying the book he had written, and the bell would sound. So then what the professor would do would put it down on the podium, open up the book, and just start reading the chapter that the students had been assigned. They'd already read this. He just read the chapter out loud. Bah, 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 bah. He would go like that for the entire class. The bell would sound. He'd close the book. Class dismissed, right? That's terrible. The class was simply about those words, the words in the book. The professor just made sure that they hung in the air for a moment. But that class wasn't about what the students could do with that information or how that information might change their understanding of something. It was just about the words. And we don't want that. But that example raises the question, how do we actually craft an audience-oriented speech? So how do we do this? I think at the core of it, you need to accurately identify the size and the nature of the gap between you and your audience. And that gap is the gap between what you know and what the audience knows, the skills you have and the skills the audience has. Okay? And sometimes these gaps are pretty small. So if I'm on a project team at work and I need to update the other team members about like some survey results, well, that's a pretty small gap. We're all working on the same projects and we know a lot of the same stuff. That's a pretty small gap. Now, sometimes those gaps are larger. So let's say I'm a data scientist. Not by any stretch of the imagination, but if I was a data scientist and I was trying to explain to a client how online advertising algorithms work, well, I can't just talk to that client like I would a colleague. Right? There's a bigger gap between our understanding of that issue. And that's the gap I need to work on closing. I will say sometimes I think the gaps are so big, you probably need to reconsider the entire topic itself. So, for example, cellular engineers now apparently can design particles that can navigate the bloodstream to deliver drugs. That's pretty amazing to me, but I certainly don't understand it. If a cellular engineer was going to explain one of their research projects to me, and I'm certainly not a cellular engineer, if they were going to explain their projects to me, they would probably have to spend most of their time talking more generally about the entire field of cellular engineering, because our gap is so big there. I don't understand so much in that field. Now, why go into all that? Because that gap and closing that gap is your value as a speaker. It's the thing that your audience gets out of the talk. I would say the challenge is correctly identifying the gaps between you and your audience, deciding which ones of those gaps you really need to pay attention to, and then closing those gaps effectively. So in this sense, the value of your speech isn't the words that come out of your mouth. It's what those words allow me as the listener to do. So when drafting up an audience-oriented talk, I move through 3 questions of invention. And we're going to talk about these 3 over the next couple of videos. But what are these 3? Well, first, what do I know about my audience? Okay, what do I know about that audience? Second, what does my audience know about the topic? And then finally, based on that knowledge, how can I craft solid speech goals that close these most important gaps? Now, why go into all of this? Because it makes talks better and it makes talks better received. Why? Because a speech is not a feast for you, it's a feast for the audience.